From the campus of Brigham Young University in Provo, the Utah Debate Commission welcomes you to the 3rd Congressional District Republican Primary Candidates Debate.
Welcome to a debate between the two Republicans running in Utah's 3rd Congressional District primary. I'm Jennifer Napier-Pierce, editor of the Salt Lake Tribune, and it's my great pleasure to moderate today's debate, sponsored by the Utah Debate Commission, an organization dedicated to educating voters and encouraging the civil exchange of ideas. On June 26th, Republican voters in the 3rd District will choose between the incumbent, Representative John Curtis, and his challenger, Chris Herrod. The winner will then compete in the November general election representing the Republican Party. During today's debate, Mr. Herrod and Mr. Curtis will be answering my questions, as well as questions from a distinguished panel. Vikant Ragula, a Sterling Scholar and recent high school graduate, is going to be joining us. Also, Alina Smith, a political science student at Brigham Young University, and Jordan Carroll, executive editor of the Daily Herald in Provo. Welcome. And you're welcome to participate, too. If you're watching or listening live, send your reactions and questions on social media to the hashtag UTDebates. That's UTDebates. I'll fold in as many of those as we can. The Utah Debate Commission's format today includes 1-minute answers from each candidate, along with opportunities to offer a 30-second rebuttal. And I'll be looking to our candidates if they want to take advantage of that 30 seconds. At my or a panel member's discretion, we may pose a follow-up question. Candidates will have 30 seconds to answer those. A coin toss backstage determined that Mr. Herrod will get the initial response to the first question and will then alternate who answers first on the remaining questions throughout the debate. So let's get started. Gentlemen, people want to know why you're running for Congress. Who are you and why do you want this job? And Mr. Herrod, you've got 1 minute to respond.
You know, my reasons for running are the same as last year. I believe that I'm the best person that's qualified for this position. I've studied in Europe, studied in the Middle East, and taught at 2 different universities in the former Soviet Union. I understand the threats that are facing this nation. I've also served in the Utah legislature, and I realize the oppression of the federal government. But I also believe that this district, which is one of the most conservative in the nation, deserves to have a conservative representative. It concerns me when the incumbent has a 50% approval rating from Conservative Review, when Mike Lee has 100%. I'm concerned about my opponent's vote for the omnibus bill. And so I look forward today to have a lively discussion because I believe that there really are dramatic differences between our 2 records.
Thank you. And Mr. Curtis.
You know, just a few short months ago, I had the honor of raising my arm to the square and being sworn in as a congressman for the United States of America, one of the greatest honors of my life. We jumped right in. We've already had our first bill passed through the House of Representatives with a 392-6 vote, which sponsored major legislation on public lands and opioids and other really important issues for this district. We've voted the way for this district would expect me to vote. We have an amazing record of reaching out to constituents in this district. We've held more town halls, arguably, than the rest of all the elected officials in the United States combined. And I've secured very important spots on committees that are very important to this district: Natural Resources, the Small Business Committee, and Foreign Affairs. But I feel like I just barely got in the game. I was put in last November 17th. And I'm asking the voters to give me a chance to go back into that game and finish what we've already started.
Thank you, gentlemen, very much. You both mentioned foreign policy, so let's start there.
Jennifer, was there a response?
Not on the opening.
Okay, sorry about that.
On foreign policy, last week President Trump canceled a historic summit with North Korea, and his national security advisor, John Bolton, has advocated use of force on the Korean peninsula to push them to denuclearization. What do you think of the Trump administration's strategy on North Korea? And Representative Curtis, you have the first minute.
You know, on this stage just a few months ago, I was asked a similar question. President Trump was being seriously criticized for his tweets at North Korea. Nobody at that time imagined that we'd be approaching talks with North Korea. Now, with that in mind, yesterday on Memorial Day, I had an opportunity to speak at a veterans event. After that event, I was greeted by a man who'd lost his son several years ago. He hugged me, and in that hug, I felt pain, severe pain. Just the week before, I had the chance to talk to the father of Aaron Butler, who died a few months ago and was serving here from Utah, and I could feel the pain in his voice. We need to be so careful when we go into war. We need to use negotiation as much as possible. I'm pleased with the progress that we're making in North Korea. I understand on again, off again, that's part of negotiations. And I'm looking forward and hopeful that we can find resolution in that important issue.
Mr. Herrod, you have 1 minute.
You know, that's one of the differences is I voted for President Trump. I support the Trump agenda. I had the opportunity to live in Europe twice during the Reagan administration. And one of the things that they always said about Ronald Reagan is that he is uneducated. He is a cowboy. He's going to get us into World War III. I think President Trump has done a very good job. You have to stand up to bullies, and you have to push them back. Ronald Reagan once said that the only thing that the Soviet Union understands is brute force. And that's exactly what you have to do with Kim Jong-un. You have to realize he has to know that we are willing to use force. Now, I believe that we should have the biggest, the baddest military, but we should use it seldom as possible. And so I support what President Trump, and this could be a historic opportunity. And so I support President Trump's agenda.
When you say that you support the president's agenda, are you saying that you would bomb North Korea? How far does it go?
Well, again, I think we're involved in places around the world, such as in the Middle East, where we shouldn't be involved. But you have to have the legitimate threat. And so that's one of the things that President Trump does. He pushes that envelope. Do I want to have a war? No, absolutely not. But at the other side, I do not want the United States to be constantly in threat from a rogue nuclear weapon. It just has to be, it doesn't have to hit. It could be simply, okay.
Representative Curtis, you say that you advocate caution in negotiation. How successful do you think the negotiations will be from this point? We're sort of at a standstill.
I had an opportunity last week as a member of the Foreign Affairs Committee to question Mike Pompeo and look him in the eye and ask him about the progress over there. I am confident that he and President Trump understand that diplomacy must be the most important tactic that we use. That warfare is only a last resort, and I'm pleased with the progress we're making in the negotiations. These things take years. We need to remember how quickly this has all come about, and we need to be prepared. And keeping in mind Ronald Reagan's trust but verify, very important.
Thank you very much. Let's move on to trade. The president postponed tariffs on steel exports from the European Union, Canada, and Mexico until June 1st. But the administration has said this is the final extension. So if the administration moves forward, EU leaders say that they will put their own duties on U.S. products, which could escalate into a trade war. I'm curious, do you think these trade policies will help or hurt Utah businesses and citizens? And Mr. Herrod, you have the first opportunity, 60 seconds.
In general, I oppose tariffs because tariffs are basically a tax on their own people. But we have been taken advantage over the last years, and so you have to be willing to threaten those. No, I don't think tariffs are great, but I think President Trump should be given a little bit of credit. I don't think that's his ultimate goal. I don't think he thinks tariffs are great, but he does think that it's not good to have Utah businesses. If somebody is charging us 10% and we're only charging them 10% or 2% in a tariff, that's not fair. The fact of the matter is we've bankrolled European socialism for years, and we've done that also with our military. And so it's important that we have trade negotiations that benefit us. I'm greatly concerned about the intellectual transfer to China, and so I think it's good, but you have to go up to that brink, and yet I don't think enough people have given President Trump enough credit on that.
Thank you. Mr. Curtis.
This is an area where I do differ with the president. These broad-based tariffs are causing problems right here in Utah. I hear from Utah businesses almost on a daily basis the difficulty of just the talks of tariffs. I know my previous business, we imported at one time 4% of the world's hardened steel. Well, imagine trying to bid on jobs now, knowing that these prices were going so far out of control on orders that are 6 months out. Imagine being a customer trying to place your order. That's what's happening through the Utah economy right now. It's difficult. Certainly, there is a place for very specific tariffs, and I would support President Trump on limited tariffs on bad actors in certain situations and feel like that we need to move forward with that. But these broad-based tariffs are not in Utah's best interest. They're hurting our economy, and we need to as quickly as possible narrow them down to just the most important situations.
Mr. Herrod, what do you say to Utah businesses who are concerned about these tariffs?
Well, again, the thing is we need to make sure. I'm also concerned. I've had numerous people come up to me, and they're concerned about the intellectual transfer of intellectual property to China. And so we have to address those issues. Yes, on specific issues, but I think as you look at President Trump, what he's done, he's threatened them, and then he's gotten better negotiations. But to say that you're never going to negotiate, you have to have that, and you have to go up to the brink. I support an American first policy, but you have to be willing to push those, to threaten tariffs.
Representative Curtis, threatening, following through. They're different.
They're very different. And I'd like to also bring up at this point, this is bigger than just the tariffs. We've got NAFTA unresolved. That's hurting our businesses as well. We need to quickly bring that to a close. Our partners on our borders are great trade partners. It's good for our economy, and it's good for their economy. So I'd like to see us move forward on that as quickly as possible as well.
All right. Let's turn to our panel. Lena Smith has a question. Lena Smith from BYU, your question.
Evidence has shown that Russia interfered in the U.S. 2016 election by creating and sharing false ads and hacking state and the DNC servers. What should the U.S. position be towards Russia, and what should be done to prevent foreign interference in future elections?
Mr. Curtis, you have the first opportunity. 1 minute.
Yeah, make no mistake, Russia is not our friend. And it's far broader than this. I just had an opportunity to tour the region, and in almost every corner, every border, every business deal, Russia's meddling is evident and obvious. We can't take this lightly. Also, one of my questions to Mike Pompeo dealt with this. He looked at us as a House Foreign Affairs Committee and said the Trump administration had done more than all the other administrations combined on this particular issue. And his follow-up was, and it's not enough. So we need to stay vigilant and do as much as we can to make sure that we're protected from that undue influence, especially in our elections.
And Mr. Herrod, 1 minute.
You know, this is something I know a little bit about, having lived 3 years of my life in that part of the world. Putin is a transactional player, and so he only responds to that. But this, again, is one of the differences between my opponent and myself, because it's important to know what is a real issue and what is not a real issue. Last year, when asked by the Deseret News editorial board, I was the only one that said that I didn't support a special prosecutor. There were constitutional issues, but there was also concern that we would get distracted. Because as long as we're talking about the special prosecution, we're not talking about Russia. Russia really has invaded Ukraine. We don't have the opportunity to address the issues that have been mentioned about interfering of our elections. And so when John last year supported the special prosecutor, what that did is that distracted us from getting to the core issues. And so, again, that's one of the experiences for me is I also had the courage to stand up for a constitutional right. If you can, without plausible cause, if you can do that to President Trump, then you can do that to any one of us. And so that's the difference between the two of us.
Mr. Curtis, 30-second rebuttal.
One of the things that's very, very important in our country and part of our freedom is the right for the American people to know, and they have an ability to know when something is right and when it's wrong. That's also important for the elected official that's accused. I know that firsthand from being the mayor of Provo. We had council members and even myself sometimes that were accused of things, and people deserve a process, even those who are elected, to get to the bottom of it so we know the answer.
Mr. Herrod, 30 seconds.
Again, I believe the constitutional rights, especially the Fourth Amendment and now the Fifth Amendment that have gone on from the special prosecutor are also important. There's absolutely no question. Russia should know that they should not interfere with our elections. But we also have to be realistic about it, that as long as we are talking about the special prosecutor, we're not talking about that issue. And so if you elect me, that's one of the things. I'll make sure that the elections are secure, but I'll also make sure that we don't go off on tangents when we shouldn't be going off on tangents.
Just to clarify, one word, yes or no. Do you support a bill that would protect Special Counsel Robert Mueller from being removed for investigating Russian interference in the 2016 presidential election? Mr. Herrod.
No.
And Mr. Curtis.
I'm smiling because you can't do this in one word. We have to remember President Trump, his administration appointed the counselor. What I would support is a far better system that was free from interference from any branch of government so that we could get to the bottom of these things.
Mr. Herrod, 20 seconds.
And I would also agree with a special prosecutor to actually look at the Mueller investigation. I think there have been numerous violations, and I think it's legitimate to have a special prosecutor to look into Mueller.
And another very quick follow-up before we go to another subject. Do you trust U.S. intelligence agencies? Yes or no? Representative Curtis.
I'm not going to let you do that in one word again. They have compromised themselves, and they've compromised our trust. We need to trust them, and we need to get back to a place where they can be trusted.
And Mr. Herrod.
The same. I think most of the people in the agencies are good, but we have been shown by the number of leaks that they cannot be trusted in their top officials. I think that the serious allegation, I think in many ways more serious than if foreign nations try to influence our elections, is if the CIA and the FBI affected our elections. And I think there's proof to that, and that should concern all Americans, that agencies, whether it's the IRS when they went after Mitt Romney supporters or other conservative groups, the agencies cannot be used against people that they don't like in elections.
Thank you. Let's go to someone on Twitter. Again, you can send your comments and questions to the hashtag #UTDebates. This from Andrew Justvig. As someone who is disabled and depends on the UTA and public transportation, how can we improve infrastructure and the transportation system in Utah and across the nation? And by my count, it's Mr. Herrod. You've got a minute.
Sometimes there's things that can be done other than that. I think we have to get out of the habit of going for federal grant money. This is, again, a difference between the mayor and myself. With UTA's BRT and Provo, Provo and Orem went after $75 million worth of grant money for a bus system that saves 8 minutes on a route. It's a project that costs $200 million. First, it's $75 million that the federal government doesn't have, and very few riders are going to use it. You look at what's happened to University Avenue, where hundreds of trees were torn out, and businesses have suffered directly of it because we were going after free money. And so for me, I think within the next decade, we're going to have self-driving cars that will make bus routes irrelevant. And so I actually gathered signatures against the BRT, but we weren't given the opportunity to have a public vote on it.
Time. Thank you. Mr. Curtis.
So, Mr. Herrod, the reason there was no public vote is because when you were in the legislature, you provided no method for a public vote on bus rapid transit. Andrew's question is, what are we doing to make sure that there's bus service available to those that are in need? Bus rapid transit, here are the facts, will transport 12,000 people per day. That's a lot of cars off our roads. Bus rapid transit will actually have more trees when it's done, Chris, than when it started. It's a project that looks far into the future. Like many things, when I was mayor, I got credit and I got blamed for things that I didn't do or didn't start. BRT started 13 years ago, before I even came into office. The leaders of this valley, in commerce and in government, got together and said, what are we going to do to anticipate this rapid growth that we had coming our way? They partially funded BRT at that time, and I was fortunate to come into that and carry that project forward. It's a good project, and it's necessary for our area to answer Andrew's question.
30 seconds.
One of the big differences is sometimes there's things that come down and you have to stand up and say no. First off, we can't afford the $75 million. But as a lifelong Provo resident, I will never use it. The fact of the matter of all taxpayers in Utah County, it's not just Provo and Orem taxpayers that are paying for it. It is people in Alpine and Payson that are paying for it. And you could have given a ballot. I gathered signatures for it. You could have paid us just like we did for the rec center. You could argue that there wasn't a regular way for that to be put on. But we were denied a vote. And the fact of the matter is, I believe that the vast majority of Provo residents do not want it. It's a boondoggle. I would encourage everybody in the next 3 weeks to drive down University Avenue.
Time. Thank you. Let's go on to another question from our panelists. Vikrant Ragula is a Sterling Scholar and graduating senior.
My question is, under the 2017 tax bill and 2018 budget passed by the Republican-controlled Congress, the U.S. deficit will more than double to over $1 trillion by 2020. One of the core values of the Republican Party is fiscal responsibility. What will you do to bring this budget deficit back under control?
And Mr. Curtis, you've got the first opportunity. 1 minute.
It's a great question, and one worthy of far more than just a minute response. Let me tell you briefly that the Tax Reform Act, if it goes on as it does, actually will help the deficit. The GDP growth rate has been 1.8% for the last 10 years. If that moves to just 2.3%, that more than covers the hit to the deficit of tax reform. Currently, we're trending just under 3%. So I think that's a very important part of your question. The other thing is we've got to change our paradigm in Washington, D.C. Here in Utah, we do a lot of things right, and one of them is the way that we budget. There's one thing that we could do back in Washington, D.C., that we do here in Utah. If we did just one thing, it would dramatically change the landscape, and that's called a baseline budget. At the first of every legislative session here in Utah, they adopt a baseline budget. Therefore, there's no threat of going into government shutdown. That's the problem in Washington, D.C. That's the one thing I'd like to try to push forward back there.
Mr. Herrod, 1 minute.
You know, I'm glad that John listened to the first debate for the convention, that John didn't show up, because that's the answer I gave. A baseline budget that we use in the Utah legislature would be very good. But the other problem is we have to have courage to stand up to leadership in Washington, D.C. And one of the reasons that I'm running is John at first touted that he had voted against the omnibus bill, but he voted for the procedural bill to bring it to the floor, which anybody that's been in the legislature is the real vote. That bill passed 211 to 207. Had John voted against that bill and gotten one other person, that bill would have failed. You had brave people like Jim Jordan, Mark Meadows, you have Raul Labrador, who is a BYU graduate from Idaho, that all had the courage to vote against it. And so we need to stop playing games, and it's not just about PR. If you truly believe that the national debt is a national security issue, that I do, I've lived through hyperinflation, then you have to make the tough votes, even against leadership.
Mr. Curtis, 30-second rebuttal.
Yes, so Chris, I'm not sure which extremist blog you got this theory from, but I can tell you this. If you'd been in Congress the day of that vote and voted the way you're suggesting I should have voted, Nancy Pelosi would have given you a massive bear hug. Do you know that 94% of the Democrats voted the way that you're suggesting I should have voted? The people who elected me last year sent me to Washington to take the hard votes, not to dodge them. That's what I did.
Mr. Herrod, 30 seconds.
Well, and then I would ask, why did Mark Meadows or Jim Jordan or Ralph Labrador vote against it? And it's because you get a tremendous amount of pressure from leadership that if you vote against it. There's a great blog, if you go, I believe it's on Conservative Review, you can talk about the history and the pressure, but that is the real vote. And so we need to get past just PR, John. If you truly believe that the national debt is a serious issue, which it is, then you need to take those type of votes. Had that happened, anyway. Fine.
Thank you. Let's move on to health care, access to health care in particular. Republicans plan to try once again to topple the Affordable Care Act and replace it with a more state-centric plan. So if not Obamacare, what should the plan for health care in America look like? And Mr. Herrod, 1 minute.
One of these things, for me, socialized medicine is not theoretical. My wife literally bears the scars of socialized medicine. I can give you horror story after horror story that system does not work. But we also have to admit that we haven't had free markets in the healthcare system for a number of years. And so what we need to do is make sure that we protect the private part that there is. I'm a big believer in health savings accounts. My dad's an oral surgeon, and I give my dad a hard time all the time because he'll spend a Saturday morning going from Home Depot to Lowe's to send $10. But we don't have that access in our healthcare system. We need to make sure that we give people the opportunities to shop individually and push the downward pressure. But we have to keep economic pressures, because the siren song of socialized medicine, it does not work. It simply leads to the lowering of healthcare and putting the middle class out of having the best healthcare system in the world.
Mr. Curtis, 1 minute.
I'm going to try in 1 minute to talk about three groups and several responsibilities in every one of those groups. The first is the government. We've got to change our broken policies that disincentivize good health. And Chris, yes, HSAs are one of those. We need to expand HSAs. They need to be able to be used for more things, such as maintaining good health, and we need to be able to put more money into them. At the federal level, we've also got to, as quickly as possible, approve Utah's waivers for an expanded Medicaid. And the third thing we have to do is we have to get out of the free markets way. You see that in prescription drugs more than anything else that's hurting us. The second category it would be us as individuals, what we need to do. We need to become better consumers. We need to ask more questions about cost and quality. We need to change this paradigm that we have that we want to be insured from $1. And we have to take better care of ourselves. And we need to own that we're not doing that. The third group would be the industry itself. They need to get more transparency with cost, get better at data sharing, and also at treating good health instead of poor health.
Mr. Herrod, 30 seconds.
You know, this is again the difference, because there's different priorities. Whenever you talk about expanding Medicaid for a system that is going to bankrupt the nation, I struggle with that. Because again, that doesn't work. Just because in the state of Utah you put more people on Medicaid, that doesn't mean that there's going to be more doctors. And what happens is then those that truly need the Medicaid don't have access to a doctor, because if a doctor has to choose between a relatively healthy patient that they lose money on and an unhealthy patient that's going to take a lot of the resources, they won't see that individual. So we can't expand Medicaid.
Mr. Curtis, 30 seconds.
Right. I would just encourage everybody to take a look at what the state of Utah has done with Medicaid expansion. It's amazing. They were bold enough to say no at first and turn away a lot of government money, and I applaud them for that. And then they dug in, and I applaud Robert Spendlove and the state legislature for coming up with a plan that protects Utah's dollars, protects our fiscal strength, but also expands it to those who are most in need.
All right, let's go to another panelist question. Jordan Carroll, executive editor of the Daily Herald.
Your positions vary on the Second Amendment. After the Las Vegas shooting, Representative Curtis, you issued statements in support of legislation requiring guns be sold with a safety device, as well as evaluating bump stocks and prosecuting gun-related crimes in federal court. Mr. Herrod, you've stated that leaders should resolutely stand for the Second Amendment and not take a step back when tragedy occurs. How would your individual stance better Utahns?
Okay, Mr. Curtis, 1 minute.
Everybody knows my background. I spent a large amount of my professional career building shooting ranges. I lectured for the NRA. I'm a concealed carry permit holder, and I have their highest rating. But I'll tell you what, I watched the news coverage on the Florida shooting, and I said to myself, I promise that I will conduct myself as if that was my own child or grandchild that had been shot in that incident. And when you do that, you can't just hide behind the Second Amendment and say that's enough. We don't need to do anything that opposes the Second Amendment. There are lots of answers out there. One of the things that I'm doing and really excited about is building a coalition of like-minded people in Congress. You know, there are congressmen that own shooting ranges built with my equipment. We have retired chiefs. We have Navy SEALs. We have people who understand firearms and also want to protect the Second Amendment. And I'm trying to bring them together in a coalition so we can bring ideas forward that actually make a difference without offending the Second Amendment.
Okay, Mr. Herrod.
You know, this is one of the reasons I got into this race. I was greatly concerned with John's statements after that. For me, the Second Amendment is not theoretical. I have friends who have lost both of their parents to Stalin's gulags. Not long after guns were taken away by Stalin, Stalin killed or starved to death 7 to 11 million Ukrainians in my wife's native country. The problem that we have is whenever a strategy, nobody's giving the voice of reason. I spoke up at the Second Amendment rally for school safety. If we want to talk about how the Second Amendment can help kids, let's talk about whether gun-free zones work. They don't. But I went around to the front after our rally, and there was 8,000 to 10,000 people demanding that guns be taken away. And many of them, there was 1,000 kids, and many of these kids were genuinely frightened. But the fact of the matter is that there's never been a safer time for a child to be raised than it is today. And school is one of the safes. Somebody needs to give that reassuring voice, or people, well, as soon as they can vote, will take the Second Amendment away.
Mr. Curtis, 30 seconds.
We've got it. You like the Second Amendment. I do too. Most Utahns want to protect the Second Amendment. But what are we going to do to give assurance to our schools, our kids, that they'll be safe? Several weeks ago, we sponsored a school safety summit. We brought together legislators, administrators, and law enforcement. We laid out an amazing grid of things that we are doing in this state to keep our kids safe, that we need to transport to other states, and things that we should do. Things that we're doing well, we have a long list. Hope Squads and the Safe Utah app. These are amazing things that are saving lives every day.
Okay.
No.
Okay, I'll give you 15 seconds.
Okay. Well, no, that is a difference. John proposed raising the age to 21 to buy a rifle to delegates. That is an infringement on the Second Amendment and a slap in the face to military men and women who carry automatic weapons around the world. And then you're going to say that they can't come home and buy a 22? That simply does not make any sense.
We tell those same folks they can't come home and buy a handgun, and we have to bring some congruity to those two issues.
All right. If you're just joining us, we're about halfway through a primary election debate featuring Republican candidates running for Utah's 3rd district seat in the U.S. House of Representatives. I'm Jennifer Napier-Pierce of the Salt Lake Tribune, moderating today's debate. Registered Republican voters from this district will decide on June 26th who will advance to the general election in November as their party's candidate. And we're still taking your questions and comments during this live broadcast. Definitely send those along to the hashtag UTDebates on social media. And we do have a question from David Boyle on Twitter. Many states are legalizing medical cannabis. Utah is considering legalization as well. How would you address federal laws about cannabis? And Mr. Herrod, you go first.
You know,
1
for
minute.
me, that's an easy question. And the first thing, the biggest hurdle that we have with cannabis is that it's scheduled as a Class 1 narcotic, which means it can't be studied. And so one of the first things to do, I'd be willing to sponsor the bill to make it so that our universities can without being in violation. Because that's the biggest problem that you have with this debate. Now, I believe in the relationship between a patient and a doctor-patient. That is very, very good. The problem of what they have is that many of them don't have the real the data. But the reason that happens is because we haven't reclassified it. Heroin or opioids are a Class 2. Now we need to at least to schedule it so that we can make sure that they can study it, and so that states have the option to be able to study it.
Okay. Representative Curtis, 1 minute.
Most of us know somebody who's impacted by this, somebody whose life could be made better, somebody in serious pain or in terminal illness. And it's really unfair that we haven't made more progress on this for them. We have an impediment in this. The single biggest impediment is the federal government, who's holding up studying medical marijuana or marijuana of all types. I've co-sponsored a bill offered by Congressman Rob Bishop to get the federal government out of the way so that we can get the research we need for states like Utah to make a good decision. This clearly is a state's right decision, and I look forward to our legislator having the data that they need so that they can make a good decision, and hopefully as soon as possible.
Can I ask a very quick follow-up? How will you vote if the initiative ends up on Utah's ballot? Mr. Herrod.
You know, that's actually that's something that I'm still debating. But in general, you know, I respect that relationship between the patient and the doctor. And if the doctor prescribes it, then I would be okay with it.
Mr. Curtis.
The initiative confuses recreational and medical marijuana use. and leaves the door far too open for recreational use. And so I reluctantly oppose that, but say to my good friends who want to see something happen that I support you and will work as hard as I can to find the right answer so we can get you the help that you need.
Great. Let's go back to our panel. Vikrant Regula, you've got a question about dreamers.
Assuming you both want to tighten our borders, what specific actions would you take to ensure immigrants or DACA kids who want to or currently contribute to our economy and society are given the opportunities to do so?
Mr. Curtis, you have 1 minute.
You know, I've met with a number of dreamers. They've come to my office, both in Washington, D.C. and here. They're amazing people. They're accomplished. And it's embarrassing that we haven't been able to resolve their situation. They wake up in the morning with uncertainty, and that's just not right. And so, like many members of Congress, I want to see an answer to that, but it's far more complicated. We also want to see an answer for border security. Right now, it's important that we secure our borders, not just our southern border, our northern border, our ports, and our seaports. But there's still more issues within immigration that we need to take a look at that are broken as well. We need to get visas figured out. We have people who want to come to this country legally, work hard, and pay taxes, and we're doing a terrible job of lining them up with industries who need their help. Right here in Utah, we have businesses suffering because we can't get those people in. We also have a problem with highly skilled visas, and they have the same fate as some of our dreamers. They wake up in the morning not knowing if they'll be here and able to stay.
All right, Mr. Herrod, 1 minute.
You know, I support President Trump in his desire to build a wall, and that's one of the things that's been different. You know, at one time John did support the wall, at another time he hasn't. One time he supported cracking down on cities, sanctuary cities, on another. He hired a police chief that stood by Salt Lake City police chief and said that he would not help the U.S. government enforce immigration law. We have to get past this, what we have in this state, that it is compassionate for us to tolerate illegal immigration. I passed the first human trafficking bill here in the state. I have a sister-in-law that was almost caught up in the horrors of trafficking. And as long as we continue to entice people to come to here, we are enticing them to risk their lives. If you've ever seen the rape trees, if you've ever seen the number of people that got up. And so for me, we cannot have a policy. We have to tell people the only way you're going to come is if you come legally. Now, if President Trump is able to get some grand compromise that deals with the DACA students, then I would be open to that. But before, if we send the message that we're just going to let everybody in, it's a problem.
Thank you, Mr. Curtis. 30 seconds.
Yeah, Chris has asked about my policy on the wall, and Chris, I'm not sure why you're asking. You've heard me say this over and over again in debates with you many times. I've been very clear. I support stronger border security. In some places, that may very well be a wall, but I'm not predetermining the answer. You know, if we're going to put $25 billion towards border security, let's be smart about it. You know, it's not only the wall that we need help with. We have 60% of the people who are here undocumented are on visa overstays, and we don't have the technology to track them and know that that's happening. That's where we need to be spending some of our money as well.
Mr. Herrod, 30 seconds.
You know, first off, John, you haven't been able to, you know, this is the first debate. You didn't show up at when we had one for convention, and this is the only one that you've agreed to. I believe that these debates are very helpful, and helpful to the audience. I'm not afraid of my position. But at some point, you say that you support the Trump agenda, and then at other points, you don't. And this is an important issue. For me, it's not theoretical. I've been outside U.S. embassies around the world and seen parents in tears when they were denied visas. Nobody speaks to them. My business partner has lost 4 of his siblings, 2 nephews and a niece, while they were waiting to come to this country. And so, for me, it's not fair that we discriminate against those people that are trying to do it right.
Thank you, Mr. Curtis.
I'd just like to point out that Chris's attempt to accuse me of dodging debates was on a night when I was casting votes in Washington, D.C., representing all of you. And I've had more debates, probably in the last year, than most candidates will have in a very, very long time.
I have two.
Look forward to the next one.
I have 2 very short follow-up questions while we're on immigration. The Utah Farm Bureau says it can't recruit enough citizens to assist with farm and ranching tasks. It's a point that Mr. Curtis has brought up. They support creating a flexible guest worker program as part of comprehensive immigration reform. Yes or no? Is this a measure that, if elected, would you support that measure, Mr. Herrod?
You know, it depends on how limited, because the one area where we used to have the Brasario program program where people could come and back. And the Democrats got rid of that. And that actually caused a lot of our problems in the 1960s. And so if there was for agriculture where somebody, was willing to put up a bond so that they could, we could make sure that we had capital to get those individuals back, and something like that, I would support something like that. But I do not support the continuation that illegal immigration is not a victimless crime. It hurts individuals.
Thank you. Mr. Curtis.
I met a U.S. congressman 2 weeks ago whose father was a first-generation cherry picker here in Utah. Now, that's pretty amazing. Second generation as U.S. congressman. We have amazing people who want to come here legally, work hard, pay their taxes, and in many cases go back home. We have to figure out a way to pair them with our businesses that are dying for additional help. We're in the lowest Black and Hispanic unemployment rate in the country's history. And our farmers, our agricultural community, our recreational community, our hospitality community all need these good people.
Okay. My second follow-up, again, 30-second answer. A Utahn who has expressed some very controversial and what some consider to be racist views about immigrants has been nominated to serve as an assistant secretary over refugees and immigration. While the appointment requires Senate confirmation and not a House vote, if you did have a vote, would you support this candidate? And Mr. Herrod, 30 seconds.
Absolutely, I support the Trump agenda, and I support Dr. Ron Mortensen. There's no individual in this state that I know that has done more for people around the world than Dr. Mortensen. He served in the U.S. military. He spent 20 years in embassies around the world helping American citizens and then potential immigrants do what they needed to come to this country. And then he spent the last 15 years risking his life on the ground for the Ebola virus, cholera epidemics, and helping people in Iraq. So I absolutely would support Ron Mortensen.
Mr. Curtis.
I haven't had the opportunity to get to know him well. Right now I'm relying on news reports and things that I've heard.
And they're all true.
And the moderator says they're all true. There is no way that this congressman will ever vote for a racist to fill that position.
Thank you. Let's go back to social media. Janet Keeler Wilcox is on Facebook. How far has our government veered from the U.S. Constitution? What do you see as the top constitutional concern? And I believe it's Mr. Curtis. 1 minute.
I think the top concern for me right now, and that you get caught up in different things at different times, but right now what's so clear to me is that the federal government has taken too much power away from the states. That we're doing things that we shouldn't be doing, and that the states can do much better than we're doing on the federal level. We see this in education, we see it in healthcare, in many, many areas. And that's one of the things I'm looking for at every opportunity is to ask, can this be, or should this be done at the state level? I think that's one thing as a mayor that I learned. Local government is always better than big government, state or federal. Ironically, as a mayor, I used to watch the state delegation complain about the federal government doing too much, and then turn around and tell the cities how they had to do things. And I understand firsthand how local government does things much better than the federal government.
Thank you. Mr. Herrod, 1 minute.
Yeah, for me, the constitutional crisis is that way too much power has gone back to D.C. And taken, it's not in Article 1, Section 8 of the U.S. Constitution. Congress shouldn't be doing it. But there's also been given way too much power from the legislative branch to the executive branch through rulemaking authority. I support Rand Paul's bill that would say if anything has more than $100 million effect on the nation, that the Congress has to vote for it. I think $100 million is too much. But the problem, and this is the practical difference between John and myself. I understand that each time, for example, what happened after the school safety bill, it gave grant money to the states. First off, the state doesn't, the federal government doesn't have money, but with that, I've learned that rules come with that. And so we need to get the federal government completely out and stop having Congress do everything But John, so far your votes have actually expanded government. They've not shrunk government.
Mr. Curtis, 30 seconds.
Well, that's easy to say, Chris. I'd like you to list those votes and be specific. I can tell you about one bill that I've sponsored, the A+ Act, which allows states to opt out of federal programs directed to locally driven initiatives. And Chris, it's easy to say, and we have hardly made it through this debate without you answering a question with my name in it. I'd like to know more about you.
But then this is the part of the problem. Every year, everybody says that they're conservative, and then they hide that. They try to pretend it's not easy being conservative. It's not easy being conservativeness. And so, John, when you said it before last time that you were conservative, but your record at Provo City of raising taxes, I added up my bills that I've paid the year before you got there. It was 40% higher. You shifted budgets from property tax to energy tax. You did something with the BRT, and that you say that you're a fiscal conservative. And I'm sorry, but I have to point those out.
And 30 seconds to you,
30
Mr.
seconds
Curtis.
to respond to that. Well, Chris, I would just say this. You and I have been running against each other for a long time. And I'm getting a little tired of your brand of conservatism being the right brand, as if I don't love the Constitution, as if I don't love this country as much as you do. I suppose from an extremist view, everybody's a moderate. But I tell you what, I've done 50 town halls during the last 3 months, and I'm right aligned with those people that are coming to the town hall meetings. And we'll see when they vote who's aligned with them. And I will tell you this, you pull out those bills, and I'll go over them with you one by one. Property taxes are lower today in Provo City than when I took office 8 years ago.
Thank you very much.
Because property has been shifted. And I encourage people to look at the town hall that happened on Saturday, how they feel about your lands bill. John, that was not popular with the group that you just had on that. And so there is a fundamental difference. And my frustration is that we can't be honest. That's fine if you're moderate or liberal. That's fine. Just own it. Don't try to do.
So, Chris, why is it that you get to define conservatism? And how is it that you own some moral high ground in saying, I'm the guy and nobody else is, unless you pound the pulpit like I do, unless you rant from the mountaintops, then all of a sudden we're not good enough for you. You watched that town hall meeting, and what you'll see last week is the best public lands bill that's put forward in an entire decade, locally driven by the local elected officials. If you watch the whole town hall meeting, you'll see the state senator, the county commissioners get up and say, we're the ones that asked for this bill.
I've got numerous calls. The problem is the platform defines. John, you signed a pledge that you agreed with the Republican platform. And except for many of the things that you proposed don't agree with the platform.
I have
I'm
to
a
cut
platform
in.
Republican.
Sorry. This was a fun little exchange. And I think we are trying to draw distinctions between the two of you. I appreciate the exchange. We need to take another question from Jordan Carroll of the Daily Herald.
At a recent Republican fundraiser where you were both in attendance, a leader said that Utah lawmakers are at the forefront of issues. However, Utah is not a leader when it comes to women's equality, specifically equal economic opportunities and political representation. If elected, what would you do to enhance the status of women?
And who's first?
Let's see. It's Mr. Herrod. 1 minute.
There some of those disparities are because some of our unique makeup. We do have a number of women that choose to stay home, and so some of that. But I'm a big believer in. I went to Silicon Slopes, the big thing that they had up in Salt Lake a couple of months ago, and I believe that they were pushing it, and that's the best way for us to do it is to raise attention. I believe that it's much better to shame an organization to do it than through making laws. And so, my wife works. I have great respect for those women that work, and for me, I don't know why somebody wouldn't pay a woman as the equal of a man, because they do, especially if they do the job better, and oftentimes they do. And so, I believe the best way to do this is through public awareness, not through a government program.
Mr. Curtis.
I'm wearing a special ring today. This is the ring that my mother gave my father in 1957 when she worked at the BYU bookstore here right on this campus. My mother was a graduate of Montpelier High School with about 8 students. She went on to get a master's degree at New York University. Amazing for a farm girl coming out of Dingle, Idaho. She later served as the first woman president of the Granite School District and inspired me. And you know what? You're right, Jordan. We're not giving women the opportunities they deserve. We're not paying them the pay that they deserve. And we need to figure out how to get to the bottom of it and what are the causes of it and what we can do better. One of my heroes on this is Pat Jones in Salt Lake City. And when I was mayor, she came to see me and she said, I'd like you to take the Elevate Her challenge, which means that you'll work to promote women within your organization and give them leadership opportunities. I am so proud that today Provo City has a woman mayor. As a matter of fact, there are 2 finalists, as everybody knows, both were women. Both of those women attended a course by Pat Jones on running for office. And those are the types of things that we can do to do better at this.
Okay. Unfortunately, I don't have time for a rebuttal on that one, but I need to turn to Alina Smith, who has a question about air quality.
How do you view the trade-offs between environmental protections and economic growth, and how should Utah and the U.S. balance these two?
And let's go to Mr. Herrod, I believe, for 1 minute. Am I wrong?
Yeah.
Sorry, Mr. Curtis, 1
Be
minute.
happy to. You know, one thing I learned as mayor is that everybody wants to leave this earth better than we found it here in our district. We want to be good stewards, and we want to take care of this. Sometimes the path forward is a little bit murky, but it all starts with personal responsibility. What kind of light bulbs do we burn in our house? Are we walking to church? Are we carpooling? Are we making good decisions? Are we buying automobiles that are more friendly? And I would advocate that that's the first place to start. But we all bear a responsibility in this, and we all need to analyze what we're doing to leave this place better than we found it. As a Boy Scout, that's what they taught me, and it's a true Utah value that I support.
And Mr. Herrod, got a minute.
Nobody likes to breathe dirty air. And so for me, it's offensive for when people in Washington, D.C. come in and come down. But the way that I view it is you do have to balance economic interests. You know, for me, partly because of my international experience, I see the relationship between developing our natural resources in rural Utah and our national security. When we develop our national resources in Emery County or in Carbon County, we actually help the United States, because when we keep energy prices low, we rob Putin of excess money, we rob Iran and Venezuela of excess money. And so for the way that I look at it is you do have to balance it. But we have to get over that the clean energy jobs in rural Utah, they need not just tourism, but they also need to continue to have that. And we will be based on fossil fuels for our numbers. Now, there's many things that we can do. I drive less often and things like that. And so there are things, but I think we have to be careful of many of the things that are out there and the overreach of the federal government.
Thank you. Representative Curtis, 30-second rebuttal.
Well, one of the things that I was very pleased with in Provo City, and I can't take very much credit for, Councilman Hal Miller led the charge on this, is the Provo Clean Air Toolkit. And I would encourage everybody to go home and Google Provo Clean Air Toolkit, and you'll see a remarkable list of things that we can all do. It breaks down responsibilities to individuals, to government, to industry, to education, and gives us a long list of things that we can do to make sure that we're taking care of this beautiful planet.
Okay. Thank you very much. Gentlemen, it's time for a final question. You'll each have a minute to respond with no rebuttal time. And it looks like, Mr. Herrod, you will go first. My question is, what keeps you up at night? And what would you do to address this single issue if elected? You've got a minute.
You know, the things that address me at night is that I see in this nation that our constitutional rights are under attack like they've never been before. And that's one of the things that I bring. People know me as a fighter. I've been willing to take the tough decisions. For example, when I didn't think that it was fair, but on illegal immigration, and I took it. I took a lot of heat. I've stood up for individuals. But I've also been willing to talk about, the national debt, which I do believe is one of our greatest national security issues. But it continues, that there's a continual erosion. And that's why I spoke at a President Trump rally the night before the election. Because I believe that Supreme Court justice was more than enough for my vote for President Trump. And so for me, I see that the judicial branch and the others, I see the overreach of the federal government. And I promise, if you send me, that I will be willing to not only vote right, but I'll stand up and teach constitutional principles and protect your freedom.
Thank you very much. Mr. Curtis.
It's an interesting question because I've slept less the last 6 months than I have all of my life. I spent a lot of sleepless nights. And at heart, for me, what keeps me tossing and turning is how do I get to this end of this experience and look back and say, I gave my constituents everything I had. I did my best, and I left nothing on the field. I want the constituents of the 3rd District to know that if you send me back, I'll give you everything. We'll continue holding the town hall meetings. We'll continue voting the way that you expect me to vote. We'll continue reaching out and working hard. In the district and right here in Utah, you'll have every ounce of everything I have to give you.
Thank you, gentlemen, very much. John Curtis, Chris Herrod, Republicans seeking your vote in the Republican primary election on June 26th for the 3rd Congressional District. Thank you both for joining us today, and best of luck to you both on Election Day. Thanks also. Thanks also to our panelists for their contributions, and thanks to those who contributed on social media. Thanks also to Utah Debate Commission co-chairs Scott Howell and Thomas Wright, who have spent many hours working to bring Utah voters these debates. And also a special thank you to Nina Sliding, the Debate Commission's executive director, for her exceptional work with candidates, media partners, and sponsors. The commission appreciates BYU Broadcasting and KBYU for hosting us today, with particular thanks to Mark Phillips, who produced this debate, and Channel 11 station manager Diana Simmons. And please don't forget to register and to vote in the upcoming primary election. Now, if you want to cast a vote as a Democrat, you don't need to register as a Democrat. But if you want to cast a ballot in the Republican primary, you do need to register as a Republican. So for more information on how and where to vote, check in with your county clerk. And also check out the Utah Debate Commission website to view this debate again or to see any of 2018's primary election debates. On behalf of the Utah Debate Commission, I'm Jennifer Napier Pierce. Thanks so much for tuning in, and don't forget to vote.